The world of magic doesn't end with the turning of a page. Love rises and falls anew, forbidden like poison or blazing like a phoenix's flame. The heroes we thought we knew uncover their hearts once more. So step into the enchantment of emotion and welcome to a world where love is written anew. The first snow of December fell softly over the towers of Hogwarts, painting the castle in silver and silence. From the windows of the great hall, where the candles floated like golden stars, Hermione Granger watched the flakes swirl across the darkening sky. It was strange, she thought, to see Hogwarts so peaceful again. After everything that had happened, the laughter echoing down the corridors almost felt unreal, fragile, like the thin layer of frost on the lake. It had been only months since the end of the war. The castle was rebuilt, the portraits rehung, the scars mended as best they could be. Many of the students had returned to complete their final year, hoping to reclaim something of their lost youth. Hermione had come back too, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to finish what she had started. And yet, though she buried herself in lessons, helping Professors McGonagall and Flitwick restore old enchantments, she sometimes felt a strange emptiness. There were no more battles to fight, no Dark Lord to defeat, only long days, quiet nights, and the soft hum of life beginning again. Her reverie was interrupted by a sudden burst of chatter. At the teacher's table, Professor McGonagall stood, a parchment in hand. The room hushed. "As you all know," she began, her voice echoing proudly, "Hogwarts has endured much. We have fought, we have lost, and now we rebuild. To honor that spirit, to remind us of joy, we will hold a winter ball on Christmas Eve." A ripple of excitement ran through the students. Even the ghosts seemed to brighten, drifting a little higher in anticipation. Hermione smiled faintly. A ball. It did sound lovely. Something to celebrate, something to look forward to. But as McGonagall continued, Hermione's name was spoken, and her smile faltered. "Miss Granger will serve as co-chair of the planning committee," said the headmistress. Given her organization and leadership during recent times, Hermione felt heat rise in her cheeks. She wasn't fond of being singled out anymore. Still, she nodded politely. Then McGonagall added, "She will be working alongside Mr. Draco Malfoy." The words struck the room like a charm gone wrong. A few students gasped, others murmured in disbelief. Even Hermione froze, unsure she'd heard correctly. Draco Malfoy sat at the Slytherin table, his expression unreadable. His pale hair caught the candlelight, his posture perfectly straight. Since returning to Hogwarts under the strict watch of the Ministry, he had kept mostly to himself. He spoke little, avoided trouble, and seemed to prefer the company of no one at all. Hermione hadn't spoken to him once since the war, and now she was meant to work with him? The great hall buzzed with whispers. "Malfoy?" someone muttered. "With Granger?" Hermione forced a steady breath. She would not protest in front of everyone. McGonagall must have had her reasons. Perhaps it was about reconciliation, a symbol that Slytherin and Gryffindor could cooperate. Still, when she met Draco's cool grey eyes across the hall, her stomach twisted. There was no malice in his look, just an unsettling calm. After dinner, she found herself summoned to the headmistress's office. The fire burned low, casting flickering light on the stone walls. "I trust you're wondering about your partner," McGonagall said, her mouth curving faintly, as if she could read Hermione's thoughts. "I suppose I am," Hermione admitted. "Professor, are you certain this is wise? Malfoy and I have every reason to despise each other." McGonagall finished briskly. "Yes, I'm aware, but the Ministry has approved his return on the condition that he contribute meaningfully to Hogwarts restoration. This is an opportunity for him and perhaps for you as well." Hermione frowned. "An opportunity to prove that old enmities can fade." McGonagall's gaze softened. "You have always believed in fairness, Miss Granger. I trust you will give him the chance to prove himself." Hermione hesitated. "I'll try." "Good," McGonagall said, turning back to her parchments. "And do remember, the ball is meant to bring warmth to this castle. Do not let your personal feelings freeze it over." Outside the office, Hermione lingered in the corridor for a long while, watching the snow fall through the tall, arched windows. She tried to imagine working with Draco Malfoy, the boy who had once called her names, who had sneered at her friends, who had stood on the opposite side of everything she fought for. Could people truly change? Could she? She sighed, tucking her books under her arm, and made her way toward the library. The next day, they met in the unused classroom McGonagall had assigned for committee meetings. The room was chilly, sunlight slanting through frosted glass. Hermione arrived early, spreading parchment and ink across a desk, determined to keep things efficient and impersonal. Then the door creaked open. Draco stepped inside. He looked much the same. Sharp features, immaculate robes, that cool air of superiority. Yet something was different. His eyes seemed tired, shadowed. The arrogance that once clung to him like a second skin was muted, replaced by something quieter. "Granger," he said simply, with a nod. "Malfoy." An awkward silence followed. The quill in Hermione's hand scratched faintly against parchment as she wrote a list of tasks. "We're to plan decorations, invitations, and music," she said briskly. "We'll need to coordinate with Professor Flitwick about the charms." "Of course," Draco interrupted, sitting opposite her. "You'll be pleased to know I have no intention of making this difficult." "That's surprising," she replied, arching an eyebrow. He smirked faintly. "Don't get used to it." Despite herself, Hermione nearly smiled. And just like that, with snow drifting against the windows and tension hanging like mist between them, the unlikely partnership began. Neither of them knew then that the winter ball would become far more than a school celebration. It would test them, change them, and perhaps even heal what war had left broken. But for now, all that could be heard was the whisper of quills and the wind outside, carrying the first promise of winter and something new. The days that followed were cold and bright, the kind of winter that made even the stone walls of Hogwarts glisten with frost. The castle had begun to hum with quiet excitement about the upcoming ball. Students debated what they would wear, who they might ask, what music would play. Every corridor seemed to echo with the same word, ball, like a spell cast in anticipation of joy. Hermione tried to focus on her tasks, yet her mind often wandered to the strange reality of working alongside Draco Malfoy. Their partnership, as Professor McGonagall had hoped, became a symbol of something larger, reconciliation. But to Hermione, it felt more like walking a thin line between civility and irritation. Draco, to her surprise, had been punctual, polite, and efficient. He handled the logistics of invitations with the same precision he once used to brew potions. Yet there was an air of detachment about him, a coolness that kept everyone, even her, at arm's length. They met 3 times a week in the same unused classroom. Hermione would arrive with a stack of parchment. Draco would already be there, usually sketching ideas for decoration charms. Their conversations were brief, businesslike, yet beneath them ran an undercurrent neither could quite name. One morning, snow was falling thick and fast outside the tall windows. Hermione entered the room with a steaming cup of tea in hand, brushing flakes from her cloak. Draco was bent over a spread of parchment, his wand tapping lightly as golden sparks outlined the design of a chandelier. "What's that?" she asked, setting her tea aside. "An enchanted frost chandelier," he replied without looking up. "It'll shimmer like ice, but never melt. I thought it might suit your taste for spectacle." Hermione raised an eyebrow. "My taste?" He looked up, a faint smirk playing at his lips. "You do enjoy things that impress people, don't you?" "I enjoy things that are beautifully done," she countered. Their eyes met, a brief, sharp clash of pride and amusement. Then Draco leaned back, his expression unreadable. "So, we agree then. Beautifully done it shall be." Over the next weeks, the unlikely pair worked with surprising efficiency. Draco handled the aesthetics, the floating lights, the music, the charms that would make snow drift gently from the ceiling. Hermione coordinated with professors and students, ensuring everything was fair and inclusive. Sometimes, when they disagreed, the room crackled with tension. Draco's dry wit met Hermione's stubborn logic in ways that left both exasperated and oddly invigorated. One afternoon, as they debated over the charm work for the enchanted snow, he remarked dryly, "You know, Granger, not every spell requires an essay's worth of theory. And not every spell can be done properly without understanding why it works," she replied sharply. He gave a low chuckle. "Of course. Leave it to you to lecture me about the philosophy of snowfall." Hermione glared, but there was a flicker of warmth in her cheeks she couldn't entirely suppress. By mid-December, the great hall began to transform. Glittering icicles adorned the archways. Silver and gold garlands shimmered under candlelight. Students from all houses volunteered to help. Gryffindors and Slytherins, Hufflepuffs and Ravenclaws. An image of cooperation that would have seemed impossible only a year ago. Yet rumours still swirled. Some whispered that Malfoy's good behaviour was an act, that he was only pretending to reform to curry favour with the ministry. Others muttered that he'd used dark magic to conjure some of the ball's effects. Hermione tried to ignore it, but each whisper seemed to reach her ears. One evening, she overheard 2 Ravenclaws talking in the library. "He's playing them all," one said softly. "My brother works at the ministry. He says the Malfoys are still under investigation." Hermione closed her book, her jaw tight. She wanted to dismiss it, to say people could change, but old memories clung too tightly. That evening, as she walked back through the quiet corridors, she found Draco standing by the window of their meeting room, staring out at the snow-covered grounds. "You're late," he said without turning. "I had to finish some arithmancy notes," she replied. "You didn't have to wait." He shrugged, still watching the falling snow. "It's quieter here. People don't look at me like they want to hex me." Hermione hesitated, unsure how to answer. The honesty in his tone was unexpected, raw, unguarded. "They'll stop," she said softly. "Eventually." He turned to her then, his expression shadowed. "Will you?" The question caught her off guard. "I don't hate you, if that's what you're asking," she said after a moment. "I just don't know you anymore." Draco's gaze lingered on her face for a heartbeat too long. Then he looked away, the mask returning. Maybe that's for the best. But Hermione couldn't shake the feeling that there was something behind his calm exterior, something weary, fractured. As the days passed, she found herself noticing small things. The way his hands trembled slightly when he cast certain spells. The way he lingered at the back of gatherings, as if afraid to draw too much attention. The way his voice softened, almost imperceptibly, when he spoke to the younger Slytherins helping with the decorations. It was unsettling. The Draco Malfoy she remembered had been cruel, proud, unkind. This one was something else entirely. Restrained, careful, and perhaps lonely. The week before the ball, Hermione stayed late in the Great Hall, reviewing the final arrangements. The enchanted snowflakes drifted in perfect patterns above her head, glimmering faintly in the candlelight. She felt a quiet satisfaction and an odd sense of peace. Then she heard footsteps behind her. "Still working?" Draco's voice asked. She turned, surprised to find him there. He had shed his robes, standing in his shirt sleeves, his silver hair falling slightly out of place. "Someone has to make sure everything's ready," she said. He stepped closer, examining the ceiling charms. "You've done well, Granger. Better than most." "Thank you," she said cautiously. There was a silence between them, not awkward, but heavy with something unspoken. Draco looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't expect anyone here to forgive me," he said quietly. "Least of all you." Hermione met his gaze. "I'm not sure forgiveness is something you can ask for," she said. "It's something you earn." He nodded, a faint, bitter smile touching his lips. "Then I suppose I'll have to keep earning it." The clock in the distance struck 9, the sound echoing softly through the hall. Hermione gathered her notes, trying to steady the strange flutter in her chest. When she left, Draco remained standing there, watching the snow drift endlessly down, as if searching for something just beyond reach. Neither of them noticed the faint shimmer of disturbed magic near the ceiling, a flicker that passed unnoticed, like a whisper of trouble waiting in the wings. The winter ball was almost upon them, and though they had worked to make it perfect, not all enchantments in Hogwarts were as harmless as they appeared. And as the moonlight spilled through the high windows, silvering the floor between them, Hermione could not shake the feeling that this story, whatever it was, had only just begun. Snow continued to fall over Hogwarts, swirling in thick, glimmering sheets that made the castle seem almost enchanted anew. As Christmas approached, the air filled with the scent of pine and the faint hum of carols from the enchanted suits of armor, who had taken to humming as they patrolled the corridors. The winter ball was now only a few days away, and excitement pulsed through every common room. Even the portraits were gossiping about who would attend with whom. For Hermione, the week was a blur of last-minute details. She had charmed the invitations to sparkle with silver script, arranged for the elves to prepare a grand feast, and triple-checked every spell that would keep the snow within the Great Hall. It was exhausting work, but the kind that made her feel alive again. Draco was nowhere near as visible as she was. He appeared when needed, calm, composed, precise, and vanished soon after, leaving behind a faint trace of cold air and quiet efficiency. Yet, in the few moments they did share, Hermione noticed small shifts in him. He no longer avoided her gaze as he once had. Sometimes, when they discussed plans, he'd allow a hint of humor to soften his voice, or a glint of warmth to light his eyes. And though she told herself it was simply the spirit of the season softening them both, there were moments that unsettled her. Brief, lingering silences where her heart seemed to forget its rhythm. On one of those cold evenings, as she made her way to the committee room, Hermione caught sight of Draco outside near the greenhouses. He was alone, leaning against the frozen railing, the faint glow of his wand illuminating his pale face. He didn't look like the arrogant boy she remembered. He looked older, weighed down by something invisible. "Malfoy," she called softly. He turned sharply, lowering his wand. "Granger, couldn't sleep." "I could ask you the same," she replied, stepping closer. The snow crunched softly beneath her boots. "It's freezing. What are you doing out here?" "Thinking," he said simply. "About what?" He hesitated, his breath visible in the cold air. "About how strange it feels to be back here, to walk the same halls and not recognize the person I was." Hermione studied him for a long moment. "You're not the only one who feels that way," she said gently. "The war changed all of us." He looked at her then, truly looked, and for the first time she saw no defense in his eyes, only weariness and a flicker of gratitude. "You really believe people can change?" "Yes," she said, "but they have to want to." He gave a small, almost sad smile. "Maybe I do." A gust of wind swept through, scattering snow across their feet. For a heartbeat, the world was silent, caught between the whisper of falling snowflakes and the faint thrum of something unspoken. Then Draco stepped back, pulling his cloak tighter. "You should go inside," he said quietly. "You'll catch cold." Hermione nodded, though part of her didn't want to leave. "Good night, Malfoy." "Good night, Granger." When she returned to the castle, she couldn't shake the image of him standing alone in the snow, a shadow of someone trying to find his way back to the light. The next morning, the castle was buzzing. Something had happened overnight. An enchanted snowstorm had broken loose in the east corridor, burying an entire staircase under glittering frost. It took 3 professors to dispel the magic, and rumors spread quickly that someone had tampered with the charms for the ball. Hermione's stomach knotted when she heard. She hurried to the Great Hall, where Professor Flitwick and a group of prefects were examining the damaged enchantments. "It's the same charm sequence used for the ball decorations," Flitwick squeaked, frowning deeply. "Someone altered the snow-binding rune. Quite advanced work, too." Hermione exchanged a tense glance with the other prefects. She didn't want to believe it, but she could already sense the direction of the whispers. By lunch, the rumor had found its target. Draco Malfoy. "Of course it's him," someone muttered at the Gryffindor table. "Who else knows how to work with charms like that?" Hermione slammed her fork down. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "There's no proof." "Come on, Hermione," said Parvati cautiously. "It's not exactly impossible to believe, is it? He's been acting strange all term." "He's been quiet, Not dangerous, Hermione said sharply. There's a difference. But even as she said it, her heart twisted. She remembered his words from the night before, the uncertainty in them, the guilt. Could he have? No. She wouldn't believe it without evidence. She found him later that afternoon in the same classroom where they had worked for weeks. He was standing by the window again, staring out at the grounds. "Malfoy," she said, closing the door behind her. He didn't turn. "I suppose you've heard." "I have. And I wanted to hear your side before I say anything to anyone." That made him turn. His eyes met hers, fierce and wounded all at once. "You think I did it?" "I didn't say that." "You don't have to," he said bitterly. "Everyone else already does." "Then tell me I'm wrong," she said quietly. He exhaled, his breath fogging the glass. "I didn't do it, Granger. I swear it. I know how it looks, but I would never sabotage something I helped build." Hermione searched his face. There was no smugness there, no deception, just exhaustion and truth. "I believe you," she said softly. He blinked, as if the words themselves surprised him. "You do?" "Yes, but we have to find out who did it before someone decides to make you the scapegoat." For the first time in weeks, his expression shifted, not into a smirk, but something close to respect. "Then we'll find them," he said. Over the next 2 days, they worked quietly, tracing magical residues and comparing rune patterns. Draco's knowledge of enchantments was sharp, far beyond what most students could manage. Hermione couldn't help admiring the focus in his movements, the quiet precision of his spells. Late one night, they found what they were looking for. A fragment of parchment buried beneath the snow-charmed cauldron in the corridor. The runes etched on it were clumsy, but familiar. "Cassian Avery," Draco said grimly, recognizing the mark. "7th year Slytherin, his brothers in Azkaban." "Revenge," Hermione murmured. "He wanted to ruin the ball." They brought the evidence to McGonagall, who handled the matter swiftly and privately. Cassian was expelled before dawn, and though the details never reached the larger student body, the whispers about Malfoy began to fade. The next day, Hermione found Draco alone in the Great Hall, watching the enchanted snowflakes drift in calm, perfect rhythm. "You were right," she said quietly, "and I'm sorry people doubted you." He turned to her, and for the first time, his smile reached his eyes. "You were the only one who didn't." Hermione felt a strange warmth bloom in her chest. "You've earned a dance for that." He raised an eyebrow, the ghost of his old arrogance flickering back. "Careful, Granger. People might talk." "Let 'em," she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Draco's gaze softened. "Bold words from the girl who once hexed me into oblivion." "And I can do it again," she teased, though her heart was pounding. The snow above them shimmered, reflecting their laughter like distant stars. Neither of them knew what the night of the winter ball would bring, but for the first time there was no bitterness in the air between them. Only a quiet spark, waiting for the music to begin. The morning of the winter ball dawned cold and crystalline, the kind of winter morning where every blade of grass gleamed under a veil of frost, and the lake shimmered like a mirror of ice. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the great hall, scattering off icicles that hung from the enchanted ceiling, and for a moment it felt as if the castle itself was holding its breath, waiting for nightfall, waiting for the celebration to begin. Hermione woke early, unable to sleep for long. Her mind was restless with final details, the charm work, the lighting, the seating arrangements. But beneath that, something else stirred, something she couldn't quite name. Excitement, perhaps. Anticipation. Or maybe the unease of knowing how much the evening meant, not just to the students, but to her and Draco both. The last few days had changed things between them. Since they had uncovered the culprit behind the snowstorm, something unspoken had settled. A fragile, mutual respect. Hermione had seen glimpses of who Draco might have been without the weight of his family's shadow, and she had found herself looking forward to their meetings, to the quiet moments when their words lingered just a heartbeat too long. Now, as she buttoned her cloak and made her way down to the hall, she found Draco there already, standing beside Professor Flitwick, making the final adjustments to the floating chandeliers. He looked composed, as always, his robes immaculate, his wand steady. But there was a lightness in his expression she had never seen before. When he saw her, he inclined his head. "Granger," he greeted. "You're early. Couldn't resist supervising one last time?" "I could say the same for you," she replied with a faint smile. He smirked. "Someone has to make sure the candles don't set the garlands on fire." "I'd have thought you'd enjoy the chaos," she teased. He looked at her for a long moment, his smirk softening. "Not tonight." There was something in his tone that caught her off guard, something almost tender, though she couldn't tell if he meant it that way. She busied herself checking the charms, but his voice still lingered in her mind like an echo. By evening, Hogwarts was transformed. The great hall glowed like a dream, its ceiling a vast expanse of stars and falling snowflakes that never melted when they touched the floor. The tables were gone, replaced by an open space for dancing, lined with garlands of silver ivy and glittering frost. Music drifted through the air, soft and inviting, and the first students began to arrive, laughing, dressed in deep velvets and shimmering silks. Hermione stood near the entrance, her gown a soft shade of blue that caught the light when she moved. She had braided her hair with silver thread, simple yet elegant, and for once she allowed herself to feel beautiful. "Miss Granger," came a familiar voice. She turned to see Professor McGonagall standing beside her, eyes twinkling with quiet pride. "You've outdone yourself," the headmistress said warmly. "This is more than a celebration. It's a renewal." "Thank you, Professor," Hermione said, smiling. "Though it wasn't just me." McGonagall's gaze flicked briefly across the room, where Draco stood near the orchestra, speaking with one of the professors. "Indeed," she said, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps some bridges are finally being rebuilt." Hermione followed her gaze, her heart giving a small, inexplicable flutter. "Perhaps," she murmured. As the music began and the room filled with motion and laughter, Hermione allowed herself to breathe. The war, the pain, the doubts. For tonight, they all seemed to fade beneath the warmth of candlelight and the sound of violins. Across the room, Draco stood alone, watching the crowd with his usual composure. Yet when his eyes met Hermione's across the dance floor, the noise seemed to dim around them. For a heartbeat, it felt as if the entire world held still. He began to move toward her. The crowd parted easily, as if guided by unseen magic. When he reached her, Draco paused, every trace of arrogance gone from his face. he extended his hand. "Granger," he said softly, "may I have this dance?" Hermione hesitated, not out of fear, but disbelief. She could feel dozens of eyes on them, the whole hall watching with breathless curiosity. For a moment, she almost refused. It would be easier to avoid the whispers, to keep her world simple and safe. But she remembered the night he had stood in the snow, admitting he no longer recognized the person he used to be. She remembered the way he had defended her decisions, the quiet gratitude when she had believed in him. So, she placed her hand in his. A murmur rippled through the room as they stepped onto the dance floor. The music slowed, a gentle waltz unfurling like snowflakes falling through silence. Draco's hand rested lightly at her waist. His touch was steady, careful, as if afraid she might vanish if he held her too tightly. "You know," he murmured, his breath brushing her ear, "I think this may be the first time you haven't scolded me in a conversation." Hermione smiled faintly. "Don't give me a reason to start." He laughed softly, a real laugh, unguarded and low, and the sound caught her off guard. She had never heard it before, not like this. They moved together in time with the music, their steps graceful, unhurried. Around them, other couples joined in, the dance floor blooming with color and motion. But for Hermione, the world narrowed to the space between them, to the faint warmth of his hand, the steady rhythm beneath the music, and the quiet surprise that this, somehow, felt right. As the waltz came to an end, Draco guided her into a final turn, and when they stopped, their faces were inches apart. She could see the reflection of the chandeliers in his grey eyes, the faint trace of wonder there. "Granger," he said quietly, almost uncertainly, "thank you." "For what?" "For giving me a chance." Hermione didn't know what to say. The words seemed too small for what had just passed between them. So she simply nodded, her heart pounding, and stepped back as the next song began. Draco bowed slightly, the old grace of a pure-blood gentleman, then turned and disappeared into the crowd. Hermione stood where he had left her, her hands trembling slightly. She could still feel the echo of his touch, the rhythm of the music beneath her skin. Around her, the ball continued. Laughter, music, the soft shimmer of snow drifting down. But the air felt different now, charged with something unseen. When she glanced toward the far end of the hall, she caught sight of him again, standing near one of the windows. He was looking her way, and for a fleeting moment before he turned away, she knew he had meant every word. Later that night, as the last notes of the final dance faded and the hall emptied into hushed laughter and soft goodnights, Hermione lingered alone. She looked up at the ceiling, where the enchanted snow still fell in perfect, silent rhythm. So much had changed, she thought. So much was still uncertain. But somewhere between the first snowfall and the final waltz, the walls between them had begun to crack, not with grand gestures, but with something far more powerful: trust. And though she could not yet name what it was that stirred in her heart, Hermione Granger left the great hall, knowing that this night would stay with her, bright and delicate as the snow that never melted, no matter how warm the world became. The following morning dawned pale and quiet, the kind of morning where the snow seemed to hush the entire world. The great hall lay empty, except for the house elves, who moved swiftly among the remnants of the night's festivities, clearing plates, gathering garlands, and humming softly as they restored the space to its ordinary splendor. The chandeliers still shimmered faintly, echoing the magic of the ball, as though reluctant to let it end. Hermione walked in slowly, the sound of her boots muffled by the marble floor. She paused in the doorway, gazing at the place where she and Draco had danced the night before. It felt unreal, too fragile, too beautiful, as though it had been something conjured only for a single moment in time. Her mind replayed every detail: the faint scent of frost and cedar, the warmth of his hand, the quiet steadiness in his gaze. She had told herself it had meant nothing, that it was simply part of the celebration, a gesture of goodwill, perhaps gratitude. And yet, beneath that practical reasoning, something else stirred. She couldn't deny what she had felt when his hand brushed hers, or how her heart had quickened when he had looked at her, not with scorn, but with something startlingly close to admiration. "Hermione!" She turned sharply. It was Ginny, standing in the doorway, her red hair tousled and her cheeks flushed from the cold. "I thought I'd find you here," Ginny said with a knowing smile. "You've been impossible to track down since last night." Hermione folded her arms. "I've been cleaning up." Ginny snorted. "Sure you have. That's what people do the morning after a ball. Tidy up and definitely not think about who they danced with." Hermione sighed. "Please, don't start." "Oh, I'm not starting," Ginny replied, crossing the room to stand beside her. "Half the school saw you dancing with Malfoy. You two were the main attraction." Hermione's stomach twisted. "Wonderful." "Relax," Ginny said, nudging her lightly. People were surprised, yes, but not in a bad way. He didn't look like the old Malfoy, more like someone trying to remember what it feels like to be human again. Hermione gave her a sharp look, but Ginny's tone softened. "You've always seen the best in people, Hermione. Maybe he needed someone to see it too." Before Hermione could respond, a soft voice interrupted them. "Granger." Draco stood at the far end of the hall, his pale hair catching the morning light. He looked almost hesitant, as though uncertain whether to step forward. Ginny's brows rose. "Well," she said, suppressing a grin, "I'll just leave you two to clean." Hermione shot her a warning glance, but Ginny merely winked and disappeared through the doors. An awkward silence settled as Draco approached. He wasn't in his formal robes anymore, but there was still something distinctly composed about him, as though he carried the remnants of last night's grace. "You came early," he said quietly. "I wanted to make sure everything was restored properly." He nodded, his gaze drifting across the hall. "It was perfect, Granger. Everyone said so." Hermione smiled faintly. "That's good to hear." Another silence followed, not cold, but careful. Then Draco said, "You left rather suddenly last night." "I was tired." "Were you?" Hermione frowned. "Is there a reason you're asking?" He hesitated, his expression unreadable. "I just wanted to thank you, not for the ball, though it was extraordinary, but for what you did before it. Believe in me, it's not something I'm used to." Hermione studied him for a long moment. "You don't need to thank me for doing what's right." He gave a soft, humorless laugh. "You'd be surprised how rare that is." Something about the quiet in his voice unsettled her. There was no bitterness in it, only truth. She wanted to ask what he meant, what his life had really been like since the war, what burdens he carried. But before she could, the sound of distant footsteps broke the moment. Professor McGonagall entered, her sharp eyes immediately finding them. "Ah, Miss Granger, Mr. Malfoy," she said briskly. "Still here? I was coming to speak with you both. The Ministry has been most impressed by the ball's success. In fact, they've requested that Hogwarts continue to host seasonal events to promote unity between the houses." Hermione smiled. "That's wonderful news, Professor." "Yes," McGonagall said, her tone softening slightly. "And I'm certain you two will make an excellent team for whatever comes next." Draco inclined his head politely. "Thank you, Headmistress." When she left, Hermione turned to him with a raised brow. "It seems we're to keep working together." "So it does," he said, his lips twitching into a faint smile. "Try not to sound too thrilled. I'm reserving judgment until I see your level of cooperation." He chuckled, and for a moment she caught a glimpse of something boyish in his smile, something unguarded and unexpectedly warm. They spent the rest of the morning helping to reset the Great Hall. As they worked, Hermione found herself studying him more closely. His movements were deliberate, almost graceful, but there was a weariness beneath his composure. Occasionally, when he thought she wasn't looking, his gaze would drift toward the window, as though searching for something beyond the snow-covered grounds. By midday, the hall was once again its ordinary self. Students began to trickle in for lunch, chattering about the ball, comparing notes about who had danced with whom. When Hermione passed a group of Ravenclaws whispering about her and Draco, she felt her cheeks burn. Draco noticed. "Let them talk," he said quietly. "They'll find something new tomorrow." "Maybe," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. As they left the hall, he slowed his pace to match hers. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "it's strange. I never thought Hogwarts would feel lighter again. Not after everything." Hermione glanced at him. "It takes time, but yes, I feel it too." He nodded, then looked at her, something hesitant in his expression. "Would it be completely out of the question if I—" He paused, reconsidering. "If I asked you to walk with me later? By the lake, maybe?" Hermione blinked. "Just a walk?" He smiled faintly. "Unless you think I'm plotting your demise." She rolled her eyes, but her heart had begun to thud unexpectedly fast. "All right, after dinner then." That evening, as the last light of day faded and the castle grew quiet, Hermione found herself walking down the snow-dusted path toward the lake. The water was frozen solid, reflecting the moonlight like a sheet of glass. Draco stood there, hands in his pockets, his breath clouding the air. "You came," he said softly. "I said I would." For a while they walked in silence along the edge of the lake. The air was crisp, their footsteps leaving narrow tracks in the snow. Above them, the stars burned faintly through thin clouds. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" Draco asked suddenly. Hermione glanced at him. "After school?" He nodded. "All the time," she admitted. "There's still so much to fix. Laws, institutions, people's trust. I want to be part of that change." "Of course you do," he said with a small smile. "And you'll succeed, because you always do." She arched an eyebrow. Was that a compliment? "Don't let it go to your head," he replied lightly. Then, quieter. "I'm not sure what comes next for me. The name Malfoy doesn't open doors anymore. It closes them." Hermione hesitated. "Then open your own." He looked at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. "You make it sound so simple." "Maybe it isn't simple," she said softly, "but it's possible." For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the whisper of wind through the trees and the faint creak of ice on the lake. Then Draco said, almost to himself, "You really believe that, don't you? That even people like me can start over?" "Yes," she said, "I do." He turned to her fully, his expression unreadable, a mix of disbelief, hope, and something deeper. "Then maybe there's more to you than even I thought." She smiled faintly. "And maybe there's more to you than you think." The silence that followed was not awkward. It was full, alive, like the pause before a spell took hold. For the first time since she could remember, Hermione Granger didn't feel like the world was something she had to fix. Standing there beside him, beneath the silver glow of the moon, she felt something else entirely. The quiet, unexpected promise that even in winter, warmth could be found. The days that followed their walk by the lake passed like a quiet dream. The snow deepened, blanketing the grounds of Hogwarts in soft white silence. Classes wound down for the winter holidays, and students lingered near the common room fires, sharing laughter and stories as though the world outside the castle's walls no longer existed. Hermione spent her mornings finishing essays by the fire, and her afternoons helping Professor McGonagall with an ever-growing pile of correspondence from the Ministry. Yet, somehow, she always found her thoughts wandering toward the same person, Draco Malfoy. She told herself it was curiosity, nothing more. After all, there was a certain fascination in seeing how much someone could change. He had once been the face of arrogance, the embodiment of everything she had despised about Slytherin House. But now, there was something else about him, a quiet, deliberate restraint, as though he were carefully building himself anew, one hesitant choice at a time. When they passed each other in the corridors, he always nodded, respectful, composed. But sometimes, when no one else was watching, their eyes would meet for a moment longer than politeness allowed. Those moments lingered. It was 2 days before Christmas when she found herself in the library long after dark, snow tapping softly against the tall windows. She was searching for a reference book on historical magical lore when she heard the faint sound of a chair scraping. She looked up, and there he was. "Malfoy," she said, startled. He looked up from his parchment, his silver-grey eyes reflecting the candlelight. "Granger, what are you doing here?" "Research," he replied simply, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "At midnight?" He gave a faint smirk. "You're here at midnight." Hermione pursed her lips, conceding the point. "Fair enough. What kind of research?" "Spell restoration," he said, his tone softer now. "I've been helping Professor Flitwick rebuild some of the protective wards. The old ones were damaged during the war. I wanted to understand how they worked." Hermione blinked. "You're volunteering?" "Don't sound so shocked," he said dryly. "I'm not—" She stopped herself and sighed. "All right, maybe a little." He smiled faintly, the tension between them easing. "Some of us are trying to be better, Granger. You should know that's exhausting work." Hermione laughed quietly despite herself. "Yes, well, I can imagine it takes effort." They fell into easy conversation after that, their words quiet against the whisper of turning pages. Hermione had never imagined she could speak so naturally with Draco Malfoy. But the library had a kind of hush that made it possible, as if the ghosts of the castle itself were willing them to lay old grudges to rest. At one point, he leaned back in his chair and looked at her thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "I always thought you were infuriating." "Only thought?" she teased, raising an eyebrow. He smiled, slow and almost reluctant. "Still do, but not for the same reasons." Her heart gave an unexpected jolt. "And what reasons would those be?" He hesitated. "You don't give up on people, even when you should." She met his gaze steadily. "Maybe that's because I know what it's like to be doubted." He didn't reply, but something in his expression softened, as though he understood more than words could convey. They stayed like that for hours, two silhouettes in the dim light of the library, the snow falling steadily beyond the glass. When the clock finally chimed 1, Hermione gathered her books reluctantly. "I should go," she said quietly. Draco stood as well. "Granger." She turned at the door. "Thank you," he said simply, "for treating me like I'm more than the sum of my mistakes." Hermione didn't trust herself to answer. She only nodded once before slipping out into the corridor, her heart strangely unsteady. That night, she dreamed of snow and light, of hands brushing in silence. And when she woke, the faintest trace of warmth lingered in her chest. The following evening, Hermione went down to the courtyard to deliver a stack of enchanted lanterns for the holiday feast. She hadn't expected to find Draco there, standing beneath the archway, watching the snowfall with an unreadable expression. "Couldn't sleep again?" she asked as she approached. He turned, surprised, then smirked. "You're beginning to make a habit of finding me in the oddest places." "Or perhaps you're simply easy to find," she said lightly. He chuckled. "Hardly. I've spent most of my life being invisible in all the wrong ways." Hermione studied him. "You say that like it's a punishment. Isn't it?" She hesitated. "Maybe not. Sometimes being unseen lets you rebuild without interference." He tilted his head, considering her words. "You always have an answer, don't you?" "It's more of a curse, really," she admitted. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither spoke. The air between them shimmered faintly, like frost catching sunlight. Then Draco said softly, "I used to think you were unbearable." Hermione laughed under her breath. "Thank you. But now—" He trailed off, his gaze drifting toward the falling snow. "Now, I think maybe I was afraid of you." "Afraid?" she repeated, startled. "You never cared who you were talking to. You spoke your mind, you stood your ground, even when I was cruel." Hermione's voice softened. "And now?" He looked at her, and the distance between them felt suddenly fragile. "Now, I'm not sure if I should apologize for the past or thank you for not letting it define me." Her breath caught in her throat. The sincerity in his voice left no room for pretense. "You've already done enough," she said quietly. He shook his head, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "Not nearly enough." A gust of wind blew between them, scattering snow across the courtyard. Hermione wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. Without a word, Draco shrugged off his cloak and draped it over her shoulders. She looked up in surprise. "You'll freeze." "I'll survive," he said, and for the first time there was no trace of irony in his tone. They stood there together in the falling snow, the world reduced to silver light and silence. Hermione could hear her heartbeat, quick and insistent, and for a moment She thought he might reach for her hand, but he didn't. He simply stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold night. When they finally returned to the castle, the corridors were dark and still. At the base of the staircase, she stopped and handed his cloak back. "Thank you," she said softly. Draco's eyes met hers. "For what?" "For proving me right," she said. "People really can change." His smile was small, but real. "Then maybe there's hope for me yet." As Hermione climbed the stairs toward Gryffindor Tower, she glanced back once. Draco was still standing where she had left him, watching her go, the faintest trace of wonder in his eyes. The castle was silent around her, the magic of winter wrapping everything in stillness. Yet, for the first time since the war, Hermione felt something stir within her. Not just peace, but possibility. Something was changing, fragile and quiet as falling snow, and though she didn't dare name it, she knew this was not the end of their story. It was merely the turning of a page, one written in the language of frost, forgiveness, and beginnings. The castle had grown quieter after the holidays. Most of the students had gone home to their families, leaving only a handful behind, those who preferred the solitude of Hogwarts in winter. The corridors seemed wider, emptier, echoing with the soft creak of old wood and the muffled whisper of snow against the windows. Hermione, for the first time in her life, did not mind staying behind. She told herself it was because she wanted the peace to study, to finish her reading before the next term. But that was only half true. The other half, the part she refused to examine too closely, had to do with the fact that Draco Malfoy had stayed as well. She saw him now and then, usually in the library or the courtyard, his wand light glowing faintly against the snow. Sometimes he joined Professor Flitwick in repairing the last of the damaged wards. Other times, she caught glimpses of him pacing the empty hallways as though he were a ghost haunting his own memories. They had fallen into a quiet rhythm since that night in the courtyard. They did not seek each other out, but when their paths crossed, neither turned away. There was a strange kind of comfort in those encounters, the kind that didn't need words. One afternoon, while the world outside was wrapped in a heavy storm, Hermione sat in the library surrounded by parchment. The sound of quills and pages had always soothed her, but now the silence felt heavier than usual. She rubbed her eyes and stood, deciding to fetch another candle from the back shelves. That was when she saw him. Draco was seated at one of the long tables, his head bent over a sheet of parchment. His expression was unusually still, his hand trembling slightly as he wrote. The candle beside him flickered, throwing faint shadows across his face. "Malfoy?" she said softly. He looked up, startled, then relaxed when he saw her. "Granger, I didn't hear you come in." "You look..." She hesitated, unsure how to phrase it without sounding concerned. "Preoccupied." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "That's one word for it." She walked closer, curiosity piqued. "What are you working on?" He turned the parchment slightly toward her. It wasn't an essay or a spell. It was a letter. Hermione hesitated, her tone softening. "To your mother?" He nodded. "She writes every week. I never know what to say back." Hermione sat opposite him. "You could tell her you're doing well, that Hogwarts is different now." "I could," he said, "but she worries, and she doesn't believe it when I say things are fine." She just wants to know you're safe, Hermione said gently. Draco looked up at her, something raw flickering behind his eyes. She spent years watching me become something I hated. I think she still sees that version of me, even when I don't. Hermione's chest tightened. People see what they remember. It takes time for them to see who you've become. He smiled faintly. You really do believe that, don't you? That people can change, that they can become something better. Yes, she said quietly. I've seen it. His gaze lingered on her for a long moment. Then he folded the letter and sealed it, as though the conversation itself had given him the strength to finish. Would you like to walk? He asked suddenly. Hermione blinked. Now it's snowing. All the better, he said, his eyes glinting with a trace of mischief she hadn't seen before. Come on, Granger. The castle won't collapse without your supervision for half an hour. Against her better judgment and her own surprise, she agreed. They bundled in cloaks and scarves, stepping into the courtyard where the snow fell in thick, slow flakes. The sky was a muted silver, the world hushed except for the faint crunch of their boots. It's beautiful, Hermione murmured. Cold, Draco countered. She laughed. You're impossible. So you've said, he replied, but his tone was light. They walked without direction, the castle towering above them like a slumbering giant. For a long while, neither spoke. Then Draco said, almost absently, Do you ever think about the war? Hermione hesitated. Sometimes, not as much as I used to. I think about it constantly, he said. Not just what happened, but what I did, what I didn't do. She looked at him, but he was staring straight ahead, his expression distant. You were a child, she said softly. We all were. He shook his head. That's too easy an excuse. I made choices, cowardly ones, and people died because of them. Hermione's breath caught. She had never heard him speak so plainly about the past. You can't undo what's been done, she said gently. But you can decide who you'll be now. Every day, every moment. That's how change happens. He stopped walking, turning to face her. Snow clung to his hair, melting into fine droplets that shimmered in the light. And you really think I can do that? That I can be something other than what I was made to be? Yes, she said, her voice firm. Because you already are. The air between them felt suddenly alive, thrumming with quiet energy. The snow felt thicker now, swirling in white currents around them. Hermione realized her heart was racing, not from the cold, but from the intensity in his eyes. Draco stepped closer, slowly, as if afraid she might vanish if he moved too quickly. You're infuriating, you know that? He said softly. Always so certain, always so good. She smiled faintly. And you're dramatic. Perhaps, he murmured, a ghost of a smile on his lips. But tell me, Granger, why do you keep trying to see the best in me? Hermione hesitated. The answer came to her easily, though she wished it hadn't. Because it's there. For a moment, they simply stood there, the snow spinning around them like a spell too delicate to break. Then Draco exhaled, the faintest trace of a smile curving his lips. Careful, he said softly. People will start to think you like me. People already think that, she said before she could stop herself. His smile widened, slow and genuine this time. Do they? Hermione turned quickly, hiding the flush that crept up her neck. Come on, before we both freeze. He fell into step beside her, and for the first time in years, she heard something rare in his voice: laughter. It wasn't sharp or mocking. It was real, warm, and startlingly human. When they reached the castle doors, he stopped and held them open for her. "Thank you," she said, stepping inside. He bowed his head slightly. "For what it's worth, Granger, I'm glad you stayed." She looked at him, surprised by the honesty in his words. "So am I." And though they parted ways in the corridor, Hermione felt his words follow her like an echo, steady, persistent, and quietly changing something in her she hadn't realized was waiting to change. That night, long after she had returned to her dormitory, Hermione sat by the window, watching the snow drift down over the grounds. The castle lights flickered faintly below, and she could just make out the courtyard where they had stood. The war had left scars that no spell could heal. On her, on him, on the world. But as she watched the snow cover the old stones of Hogwarts, she realized that maybe healing didn't happen all at once. Maybe it began like this, quietly, between two people who had once been enemies, finding warmth again in a world that had forgotten how to be kind. And somewhere deep in her heart, Hermione Granger dared to believe that the story she had thought finished was only beginning to unfold. Winter at Hogwarts lingered long past its welcome that year. The snow grew heavier, the skies greyer, and the wind that swept across the Black Lake bit sharper with every passing day. Yet within the old stone walls, warmth had begun to take root in unexpected places. Not from the fires in the common rooms, nor from the enchanted torches that lined the corridors, but from something quieter, more fragile. Hermione found herself waking each morning with a strange anticipation she refused to name. Her days followed their usual rhythm: lessons, study, letters to the ministry about reform proposals. But her thoughts drifted often toward a certain silver-haired wizard who now crossed her path far too often to be coincidence. Draco had changed. The bitterness that once clung to him like a curse had faded into something more measured, reflective. He no longer carried himself with the prideful arrogance that had once made him impossible to bear. Instead, he moved with the wary grace of someone trying to learn what it meant to belong again. They met often in the library, sometimes by chance, sometimes by unspoken agreement. Hermione told herself it was merely convenient, that working together on McGonagall's new project to improve inter-house relations required cooperation. Yet the hours spent at that long oak table, surrounded by the scent of parchment and candle wax, seemed to pass in moments rather than minutes. On one such afternoon, as pale light filtered through the frosted windows, Draco looked up from a book of old Hogwarts enchantments. "You've been staring at that page for nearly 5 minutes," he said. Hermione blinked. "I have not." "You have," he said, lips curving into a faint smirk. "And unless you've suddenly found a brief history of castle wards enthralling, I'd say your mind is elsewhere." She frowned, though the corner of her mouth threatened to betray her. "Perhaps I'm thinking about how you've managed to read that entire volume upside down." He glanced down, and sure enough, his book was indeed inverted. His smirk faded into a sheepish laugh, quiet and genuine. Hermione stared at him for a moment, startled by how different he looked when he smiled like that. Not guarded, not cold, but human. "Don't tell anyone," he said, flipping the book around. "I wouldn't dream of it," she said lightly. Silence settled again. but it was a comfortable one. The only sounds were the crackle of the nearby fire and the faint whisper of snow against the glass. Draco's presence had become oddly reassuring, a steady rhythm against the chaos of her thoughts. When she finally closed her book, he glanced up. "Done already?" "For now. McGonagall asked me to check on the charms corridor wards later. They've been flickering again." "Do you want company?" Hermione hesitated. She had grown used to doing everything alone, yet something in the quiet sincerity of his tone made her nod. "All right, if you'd like." Later that evening, they walked side by side down the deserted corridor. The torches burned low, casting long shadows on the walls. Hermione raised her wand, tracing the flicker of the old protection charm that shimmered faintly along the stone. "They're unraveling faster than I expected," she murmured. "The castle's old magic is temperamental after the reconstruction." "Can it be restored?" Draco asked, watching her wand work closely. "With enough patience." He smiled faintly. "Then it's fortunate patience is your specialty." She glanced at him. "And sarcasm is yours." "Someone has to maintain balance," he said. Hermione rolled her eyes, but couldn't help smiling. They moved along the corridor, testing and mending each charm as they went. When they reached the last, a spark flared unexpectedly bright, and Hermione stumbled back, her wand flickering. "Granger!" Draco caught her by the wrist before she could fall, his hand firm and warm against her skin. "I'm fine," she said quickly, though her pulse had begun to race. He didn't release her immediately. His fingers lingered a second too long, his eyes searching hers as though he wanted to be sure. "You're certain?" "Yes," she breathed. He let go, stepping back, his usual composure slipping for just an instant. The corridor seemed too quiet, the air too charged. Hermione forced herself to look away, pretending to adjust the charm's shimmer with a wave of her wand. "Thank you," she said finally. He inclined his head. "You would have done the same." They finished the inspection in near silence, though the tension between them hummed like invisible magic. By the time they reached the main staircase, the castle had fallen completely still, the torches dimming as midnight neared. Hermione turned to him. "I should go. It's late." "Of course," he said. But he didn't move. He simply stood there, watching her with that same unreadable expression she'd begun to recognize, a mix of curiosity, restraint, and something else she dared not name. When she finally turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Granger." She looked back. "Why do you still trust me?" She blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean?" He took a slow breath. "Everyone else looks at me and sees the past. You don't. Why?" Hermione studied him. "Because I know what it's like to be judged for things beyond your control. Because I believe what someone does now matters more than what they did then." His gaze softened. "That's a very Gryffindor answer." "It's the truth," she said quietly. He smiled, not the practiced smirk she remembered, but something small and genuine. "You really are impossible to argue with." "Only when I'm right," she said. He laughed softly, and for a moment the shadows around them seemed to recede. Then he said, almost hesitantly, "You make it very difficult to stay the person I was." Hermione met his eyes, her heart tightening. "Good." That single word hung between them like a spell neither dared to break. When she finally climbed the stairs to Gryffindor Tower, Hermione couldn't shake the sound of his voice from her mind. Low, uncertain, but filled with something she had never heard from him before: sincerity. The next morning, she found a note waiting on her desk in the library. The parchment was folded neatly, her name written in careful script. "Thank you for last night. I'm beginning to think Hogwarts itself has a sense of irony, making me learn decency from the one person I least deserve it from." DM Hermione read it twice, smiling despite herself. She tucked it into her book before anyone could see. That evening, when she passed him in the corridor, he didn't say anything, only gave her a faint nod, a trace of amusement in his eyes. But that small, shared understanding between them spoke louder than any words. And as the snow continued to fall, covering the grounds in endless white, Hermione realized that whatever was happening between them was no longer just about forgiveness or redemption. It was about discovery of who he truly was and who she might become beside him. In the long hush of winter, beneath the endless drift of snowflakes, something new was taking shape, a fragile, shimmering thing that neither of them could name, but both could feel, growing quietly like the first spark of spring beneath the ice. The weeks that followed were marked by the slow thaw of winter, though the world beyond Hogwarts still lay buried under snow. Icicles hung from the eaves like rows of crystal daggers, and the lake shimmered beneath its frozen skin. Yet inside the castle, the air was changing, not with the warmth of spring, but with something more subtle, something alive. Hermione felt it every time she saw Draco. The tension that had once existed between them had shifted, softened into a quiet familiarity that neither fully acknowledged. They shared late-night study sessions in the library, exchanged wry remarks in the corridors, and occasionally lingered over cups of tea in the kitchens after curfew. She told herself it was friendship, fragile, tentative, but nothing more. And yet, there were moments when the world seemed to hold its breath around them, when a look or a word carried more meaning than either dared admit. It was during one of those evenings, long after most students had gone to bed, that Hermione found herself once again in the library. The lamps glowed low and golden, casting long shadows across the shelves. Draco sat beside her, one hand propped under his chin, eyes scanning a book on advanced transfiguration theory. "You're quiet tonight," he said after a while, not looking up. "I was thinking," she replied. "Dangerous habit." She rolled her eyes. "You sound like Ron." He smirked faintly. "Granger, I assure you, the day I sound like Weasley, I'll hex myself into next week." Hermione couldn't help but laugh, a sound that seemed to surprise them both. It echoed softly through the empty room, mingling with the gentle crackle of the fireplace. Draco set his book aside and leaned back, studying her. "You've changed, you know." "Have I?" "Yes." He tilted his head slightly, his gaze thoughtful. "You used to look at the world like it was something you needed to fix. Now you look at it like it might fix itself, if you'd only let it." Hermione blinked, caught off guard. "That's rather observant of you." He smiled faintly. "I notice things." She hesitated, then asked, "And what do you see when you look at yourself?" His smile faded. For a long moment, he said nothing. The shadows danced across his face, softening the sharpness of his features. "I see someone trying very hard not to be the person everyone remembers," he said finally. "You're not him anymore," she said gently. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Maybe not, but I still carry the ghosts of who I was. Some days, I wonder if they'll ever stop following me." Hermione reached across the table before she could think better of it, her hand brushing his. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a spark through the air. Subtle, electric, undeniable. "They will," she said softly, "when you stop letting them." He didn't pull away. For a moment, they simply sat there, suspended in that fragile stillness, the weight of the past dissolving like frost in sunlight. Then the library doors creaked open. Both of them jumped, withdrawing their hands as Filch's footsteps echoed faintly down the corridor. Hermione gathered her books in a rush, whispering, "Quick, before he catches us." Draco chuckled, rising to his feet. "Still afraid of detentions, Granger?" "Still determined to avoid unnecessary trouble," she retorted. They slipped out the side door, moving swiftly through the dim corridors until they reached the marble staircase. When they stopped to catch their breath, Hermione found herself laughing again, quietly, helplessly. Draco watched her, his expression softening into something that made her chest tighten. "You're impossible," he murmured. "And yet you keep following me," she said, still breathless. "Maybe I've finally gone mad. Maybe you have." They stood there for a moment, the silence between them rich with something unspoken. Then Hermione said, "Good night, Malfoy," and turned to climb the stairs. "Good night, Granger," he said, his voice low. When she reached the landing, she glanced back once and saw him still watching her, a faint, wistful smile on his lips. The next morning, Hermione woke to find the sun glinting off the snow, scattering light across her room. She felt oddly light herself, as though something inside her had begun to shift, to thaw. Over the next few days, whispers began to circulate through the castle again. Not malicious ones this time, but curious, uncertain. People had noticed the way Draco lingered near her in the corridors, how their conversations seemed too comfortable to be coincidence. Some students looked at her with surprise, others with quiet approval. Hermione ignored them as best she could. She told herself it didn't matter. But deep down, she knew that something had changed. Not just in how people saw them, but in how she saw him. It was a cold evening in February when that truth finally became impossible to deny. Hermione had been working late in the library again when the lamps began to flicker. A faint tremor ran through the floor, followed by a gust of icy wind that snuffed out half the candles. She frowned, standing quickly. The magic in the air felt wrong, uneven. And then, from the far end of the corridor, she heard a low hum, a sound like air being drawn through a keyhole. She ran toward it, wand raised, heart pounding. At the center of the corridor, near the old suits of armor, stood Draco, his wand alight, his face pale. A shimmer of unstable energy swirled before him, twisting like smoke. "What happened?" Hermione demanded, rushing to his side. "I don't know," he said sharply. "The ward we restored last month, it's unraveling again. But this isn't just a simple charm failure. Someone's tampered with it." Before she could reply, the magic surged, sending a blast of cold wind down the corridor. Hermione's hair whipped across her face as she shielded her eyes. Draco moved instinctively, stepping in front of her, his arm raised to deflect the worst of it. When the gust subsided, the energy had vanished, leaving only a faint scorch mark on the wall. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low but steady. "Yes," she said, catching her breath. You? He nodded, though his hand trembled slightly as he lowered his wand. Someone's been tampering with the castle's enchantments again. It's deliberate this time. Who would do such a thing? I don't know, he said, his gaze darkening. But whoever it is, they're not just careless, they're clever. Hermione's heart raced. The thought of someone endangering Hogwarts, their home, their fragile peace, filled her with dread. We have to tell McGonagall, she said. Draco nodded. Tomorrow. But for tonight. He glanced at her, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. You should rest. I'll keep watch here for a while. I'm not leaving you alone with whatever that was, she said firmly. He gave a small, weary smile. Of course you aren't. So they stayed there together in the dim corridor, the remnants of broken magic still crackling faintly in the air. Neither spoke much after that. But as the night wore on and the castle settled into silence, Hermione realized that whatever danger lay ahead, she no longer faced it alone. Draco Malfoy, once her rival, once her enemy, had become something far more complex. A companion, a mystery, perhaps even a mirror of her own restless heart. And as dawn began to creep through the high windows, painting the corridor in pale gold, Hermione knew that everything between them was about to change. Again. Morning light spilled through the high windows of the great hall, scattering gold across the long tables and the enchanted ceiling that still shimmered faintly with remnants of night. The storm had passed, but the tension it left behind lingered like smoke after a fire. Hermione sat at the Gryffindor table, her breakfast untouched, parchments spread before her. She had barely slept. Across the hall, Draco stood speaking quietly with Professor McGonagall. His posture was composed, but Hermione could see the strain in his shoulders, the fatigue around his eyes. They had spent most of the night tracing the source of the magical disturbance, but whatever had caused the wards to fail had vanished without a trace. When McGonagall dismissed him, Draco caught Hermione's gaze from across the room. He gave a faint nod, an unspoken invitation, before turning to leave. Hermione gathered her notes and followed him out into the corridor. They met in the courtyard, where frost still clung to the flagstones. The morning air was crisp and sharp, the sunlight weak but pure. "Well?" she asked. "Did she find anything?" Draco shook his head. "No. She believes it was residual magic from the reconstruction, but it wasn't. You saw it. That energy wasn't random." "I know," Hermione said, frowning. It felt deliberate, controlled. He paced a few steps, hands clasped behind his back. Whoever did it knew exactly where to strike. That charm protected one of the main energy conduits that stabilizes the entire West Wing. If it collapses, half the castle's enchantments could fail. Hermione finished grimly. "Yes, I know." He stopped pacing and looked at her. "We need to find out who did it before they try again." Hermione hesitated. "Do you think it's a student?" "I don't know," Draco admitted. "But whoever it is, they're not just experimenting. They have purpose." For a moment, the wind carried nothing but the sound of their breathing. The castle loomed above them, ancient and silent, as if listening. "We'll have to be careful," Hermione said finally. "The last thing we need is panic." Draco nodded. "Agreed. We'll keep this between us and the headmistress. Then we'll start by checking the wards again tonight, Hermione said. Together. His mouth twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. Of course, I wouldn't dream of letting you handle dangerous magic alone. She gave him a wry look. You'd never forgive yourself if I outperformed you. Merlin forbid, he said, laughing quietly. They parted ways soon after, but Hermione couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that followed her through the day. Something about the disturbance had felt familiar, not in form, but in intent. Whoever had cast that magic had done so with precision, not chaos. It was as if they wanted to test the castle's limits, to probe for weaknesses. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Hermione found herself back in the west corridor, her wand casting a steady glow along the ancient stones. Draco was already there, standing near the damaged section of wall. "You're early," she said. "So are you. I didn't trust you not to start without me." He smirked faintly. "I'm learning not to take offense when you assume the worst." They began their work in silence, tracing the remnants of the failed charm. Hermione murmured detection spells under her breath, watching the faint blue threads of magic weave through the cracks in the stone. Draco examined the ward's anchor point, his movements precise and methodical. After nearly an hour, Hermione found something, a faint residue of dark green light embedded in the corner rune. She crouched, frowning. "Malfoy, look at this." He joined her, kneeling beside the wall. "That's not Hogwarts magic." "No, it's..." She hesitated, tracing the glow with her wand tip. "Slytherin lineage magic." Draco stiffened. "Old magic. Family magic." "Yes." Hermione met his eyes. "It shouldn't exist anymore. The Ministry banned the use of blood-bound enchantments after the war." He looked away, jaw tightening. "Then someone didn't get the memo. Do you recognize it?" He hesitated. "I've seen something similar in the manor. My father used to inscribe protective seals in his study. They looked like this." Hermione's heart sank. "Are you saying this could be—" "No," Draco interrupted firmly. "He wouldn't. He can't. He's under watch, and besides—" He trailed off, his expression shadowing. "My father isn't capable of this kind of subtlety anymore." Hermione touched the wall again, her fingers brushing the cold stone. "Then someone learned it from him." Draco rose slowly. "Someone who knows enough to hide their trail." When they finally left the corridor, the last of the candles had guttered out, leaving only moonlight to guide their way. The castle felt different, quieter, as though it were holding its secrets close. They walked together in silence until they reached the stairwell. Hermione stopped there, exhaustion catching up to her. "We'll tell McGonagall tomorrow. She needs to know what kind of magic we're dealing with." Draco nodded, though his expression was distant. "I'll prepare the records I have. There might be something in my family archives that matches this." Hermione hesitated. "Are you sure that's a good idea? If the Ministry finds out you're looking into—" "They won't," he said quietly. "And if it helps protect Hogwarts, then it's worth it." She studied him for a long moment, her heart tightening again. "You really have changed, you know?" He gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "Don't tell anyone. It might ruin my reputation." "I think it's already ruined," she said with a grin. He laughed softly, and for a brief moment the heaviness lifted. Then he said, "Good night, Granger." "Good night, Malfoy." But when Hermione returned to her room, she couldn't sleep. Her mind was restless, turning over the possibilities. Who could have used such magic, and why? The thought of ancient Slytherin spells being resurrected filled her with unease. In the silence of the night, a faint sound reached her ears. The low hum of magic, distant but unmistakable. It pulsed once, then faded. Hermione sat up, heart pounding. It was coming from the lower floors, near the west wing. Without thinking, she grabbed her wand and her cloak and ran. The corridors were dark and cold, her footsteps echoing softly. As she turned the corner, she caught sight of movement ahead. A figure cloaked in shadow, their wand glowing green. The same sickly colour she had seen in the wall. "Stop!" she shouted. The figure turned sharply, and for a heartbeat, she thought she saw familiar pale hair gleam in the light. Then the spell flashed, blinding her, and the figure vanished through the wall as if swallowed by the stone. Hermione stood frozen, her breath ragged. The ward's residue still shimmered faintly, reacting to the vanished magic. It pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, slow, deliberate, mocking. She didn't know what terrified her more, the magic itself, or the fleeting thought that the figure might not have been a stranger at all, that it might have been Draco. And as the last echoes faded into silence, Hermione realized that whatever shadow had awakened in Hogwarts was no longer content to remain hidden, and that the fragile trust she had built with Draco Malfoy was about to be tested in ways she could never have imagined. The castle did not sleep that night. Though the corridors were empty and the portraits stilled in uneasy silence, Hermione could feel the restless hum of magic in the air, faint, pulsing, alive. The disturbance in the West Wing had changed something, shifted the delicate balance of Hogwarts enchantments. Even the staircases creaked uneasily, as if whispering warnings from their ancient stones. Hermione didn't sleep either. She sat in the common room long after midnight, the dying fire casting long shadows across the walls. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned Draco's note over in her lap, the one he had written to thank her weeks ago. She read the familiar scrawl again, tracing the careful strokes of his initials. The image of that shadowed figure replayed in her mind, again and again. Pale hair, the glint of green light, the shape of his shoulders. She had told herself it couldn't be him, that it wasn't him. But doubt had a way of sinking its claws into the strongest certainty. By dawn, she had made her decision. She would find out the truth. The morning broke cold and grey. Snow still fell, silent and steady, blanketing the world outside in a kind of deceptive peace. Hermione wrapped herself in her cloak and made her way toward the east courtyard, where she knew Draco often took his breakfast alone. She found him there, leaning against the stone balustrade, a book in one hand and steam rising from a cup of tea at his elbow. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment his expression softened, before he noticed the look on her face. "Granger," he said carefully, "you look like you've been awake all night." "I have," she replied. "We need to talk." Something flickered in his eyes. He closed the book slowly. "All right." "There was another disturbance," she said, stepping closer. "Last night, near the West Wing again. Someone was there, using the same magic as before." Draco's brow furrowed. "What kind of magic?" "The same green residue we found on the wall," she said. bloodbound, ancient Slytherin magic. He stiffened but said nothing. I saw them, Hermione continued, just for a moment before they disappeared. Their wand light was green, their hair... She hesitated, the words catching in her throat. It could have been you. Silence fell like a weight between them. Draco's face went pale, his grey eyes flashing with shock and something else. Hurt. You think I did it? I don't know what to think, Hermione said, her voice low but steady. But I saw what I saw, and if there's even a chance... You'd accuse me, he finished bitterly. After everything we've done to fix this place. After everything I've tried to prove to you. I'm not accusing, she said. I'm asking you to tell me the truth. His jaw clenched. You think I'd sabotage Hogwarts? That I'd use my family's curses after I spent years trying to bury them? Then explain it, she said sharply, because the person I saw last night looked like you. The words hung in the cold air between them, sharper than any spell. Draco turned away, his breath visible in the freezing morning. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, I didn't do it. Hermione's heart twisted. Then who did? I don't know, he said. But if someone's using Malfoy magic, they learned it from someone with access to my family's archives, which are sealed by the Ministry. He gave a humorless laugh. Sealed means nothing to someone who knows where to look. Hermione studied him. There was no guile in his voice, no flicker of deceit in his eyes, only frustration and a shadow of fear. She believed him, or at least she wanted to. I'll help you, she said finally. We'll find out who's behind this together. Draco looked at her, surprise flickering in his expression. Even after what you saw? She nodded. Especially after what I saw. For the first time that morning, some of the tension in his shoulders eased. You're either incredibly brave, he said softly, or incredibly foolish. Both, she admitted. Now come on. If this magic was drawn from your family's archives, we need to start there. By afternoon, they had made their way to the small tower room McGonagall had repurposed as the archive annex. A place where confiscated dark artifacts were studied before being transferred to the Ministry's Department of Magical Oversight. The air inside smelled of dust and faint metal, old enchantments humming just beneath the surface. Draco led the way, his expression set. My family's collection used to fill 3 vaults at Gringotts, he said quietly. Cursed objects, heirlooms, spellbooks, most of them older than the castle itself. When the Ministry raided the manor, they confiscated nearly everything. But a few items were deemed too unstable to move. Hermione's brow furrowed. And McGonagall allowed them to store them here? She had no choice, Draco replied. Hogwarts wards were the only ones strong enough to contain them safely. They stopped before a heavy iron chest bound with silver runes. Hermione knelt beside it, her wand glowing faintly. There's still a preservation charm active, she murmured. Whoever accessed this didn't do it by force. Draco crouched beside her, tracing the runes with his fingers. These locks respond to blood. Malfoy blood. No one but my family could open it. Hermione met his gaze. Then it has to be someone connected to you. A shadow crossed his face. There's only one possibility. My cousin, Cassian Avery, the same one who tried to sabotage the ball. His mother was a Malfoy before she married. He'd have inherited partial access to the bloodline wards. Hermione exhaled slowly. Then he's not finished. No, Draco said grimly. He's not. As if to punctuate his words, the chest gave a sudden pulse of green light. The runes flared, burning with an intensity that made Hermione stumble back. Draco grabbed her arm, pulling her clear just as a faint crack split the metal lid. Someone's activated it, Hermione said, her voice tight. From outside. Draco's grip on his wand tightened. He's here. They exchanged a single look, then ran. The corridors echoed with their footsteps as they raced toward the west wing. The air grew colder with every turn, the faint green shimmer of corrupted magic lighting the walls. When they reached the old hallway where the disturbance had begun, they saw him, Cassian Avery, pale, gaunt, his eyes gleaming with a feverish light. His wand blazed green as he traced symbols across the stones, the magic twisting and writhing like smoke. "Cassian!" Draco's voice rang out, sharp with anger. "Stop this!" Cassian turned, a cruel smile twisting his mouth. "Draco, still playing the repentant hero, I see. Tell me, do they applaud you now? Do they forget what you were?" "This isn't the way," Draco said, stepping forward. "You're tampering with magic you don't understand." "Oh, I understand it perfectly," Cassian sneered. "This castle took everything from us. You think you can cleanse your name by helping them? I'll show them the power that still runs in our blood." Hermione raised her wand. "Whatever you're planning, it ends now." Cassian's eyes flicked to her. Ah, the Gryffindor saint, standing beside a Malfoy. How poetic. Then he flicked his wand, and the corridor erupted in light. The spell burst like a thunderclap, sending shards of energy spiraling through the air. Hermione's shield charm flared, deflecting most of it, but the force knocked her to her knees. Draco moved instantly, countering with a blast of white light that collided with Cassian's curse mid-air, sending sparks flying. "Run!" Draco shouted. "I'm not leaving you." Another spell flew, green and vicious, missing Draco by inches. He turned, eyes blazing. "Then fight!" And she did. The corridor filled with the roar of clashing magic, the air alive with heat and frost. Hermione's spells shone like fire against Cassian's dark runes, each burst lighting the ancient stones. At last, Draco disarmed him with a single decisive strike. Cassian's wand flew from his grasp, clattering across the floor. He staggered, eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't stop it!" he hissed. "The blood magic is awake now. It won't end with me." Then he vanished, disapparating with a crack that echoed through the halls. Silence fell, broken only by the faint crackle of dying magic. Hermione leaned against the wall, her heart racing. Draco stood beside her, breathing hard, his face pale but steady. "It's over," she whispered. "For now," he said. "But he's right about one thing. It's not finished." Hermione met his gaze, the flickering torchlight reflecting in his eyes. "Then we finish it together." He nodded slowly. Together. And in that single word, spoken in the aftermath of chaos, there was both promise and peril. A bond forged not by chance, but by choice, sealed in fire and trust, and the faint, perilous hope that they might yet save what was worth saving. The castle slept under the hush of a cold, unbroken dawn. Mist coiled across the grounds like breath from an invisible beast, and the spires of Hogwarts loomed dark and watchful over the pale morning. In the wake of the night's battle, the corridors bore faint traces of what had transpired. Scorch marks upon the walls, the air thick with the scent of burnt magic and stone. Hermione stood by the window of the hospital wing, watching the first light creep over the forbidden forest. Her robes were torn at the hem. A faint bruise shadowed her temple, but she hardly noticed. She had not slept. In one of the beds behind her, Draco lay still, pale against the white sheets. Madame Pomfrey had forced him to stay after a charm backfired during the fight. Nothing fatal, she had said, though Hermione had nearly argued otherwise when she saw him collapse. Now he rested, his breathing steady but shallow, a streak of dried blood tracing his cheek. Hermione turned from the window and approached his bedside. For a long time she only stood there, watching him, the soft rise and fall of his chest. The cold morning light softened his sharp features, making him look impossibly young, too young to carry the weight he bore. When his eyes fluttered open, she startled. "Granger!" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I'm here," she said quickly, moving closer. "You shouldn't speak. Pomfrey said—" "Pomfrey always says things," he murmured, attempting a weak smile. Did we stop him?" "For now," she replied. "Cassian escaped, but the magic he unleashed is contained. McGonagall has placed protective seals on the entire West Wing. The castle's stable again." He exhaled slowly. "Good." His gaze shifted toward her, the faintest glimmer of humor returning. "You look terrible." Hermione gave a soft laugh, though her throat ached. "You're one to talk." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Draco said quietly, "You could have been killed." "So could you," she replied. "Yes, but that's expected of me." He tried to sit up, winced, and sank back against the pillow. "You, on the other hand, have a habit of throwing yourself in front of curses meant for other people." "I wasn't about to let you face him alone." His eyes met hers, grey and tired, but steady. "Why?" Hermione hesitated. She could have said it was duty or decency or simply the right thing to do. But none of those words fit the truth that had rooted itself quietly inside her. "Because I couldn't," she said at last. Draco studied her, the corner of his mouth lifting faintly. "You're insufferable, Granger." "So, you keep saying," she murmured, but her smile trembled. He closed his eyes again, exhaustion overtaking him, and she sat there beside him until the morning bells tolled. By the next day, Draco was strong enough to walk. McGonagall summoned them both to her office, her face drawn with fatigue, but her eyes as sharp as ever. The air between them was heavy with unspoken urgency. "I've just come from the ministry," she said, setting aside a stack of correspondence. "They've confirmed Cassian Avery's disappearance. His family's holdings are being searched, but there's been no trace. However," she paused, her gaze falling on Draco, "they believe he left something behind." Draco frowned. "A spell?" "A fragment," McGonagall said grimly. "Whatever he awakened within the castle was only the beginning. The blood magic you described, ancient, bound to lineage, it's been dormant for centuries. The ministry believes it may still be anchored to Hogwarts' foundation stones. We'll need to find the source before it reactivates." Hermione's stomach sank. "If it's bound to the castle, we can't remove it without risking the wards." "Precisely why I need you both," McGonagall said. "You've already proven you can work together. Find where the spell is rooted and destroy it before it stirs again." Draco inclined his head. "We'll handle it." As they left the office, Hermione glanced at him. "You're sure you're strong enough?" He gave a soft snort. "Don't tell me you're worried." "I always worry when I'm about to dismantle an ancient blood curse." He smirked. "Fair." The search led them deep beneath the castle, through winding corridors few had walked in centuries. The dungeons were cold and damp, the walls slick with age-old frost. Torches flickered weakly as they descended, their light catching on carvings so old they had nearly vanished into the stone. Draco led the way, his wand glowing faintly. "There," he said, pointing to a narrow archway ahead. The passage beyond descended in a spiral, the air thick with ancient enchantments. Hermione's wand hand tightened. "This must lead to the foundation chambers. I read about them once. They were sealed after the Founder's time." "Which explains why the Ministry never found this place," Draco muttered. They followed the spiral downward until the walls opened into a vast circular chamber. The air shimmered faintly with residual magic, and in the center stood an altar of black stone, etched with the same green runes Hermione had seen before. The symbols pulsed, faint but steady, like the slow beat of a heart. Draco stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "This is Slytherin's work, the original blood anchor." Hermione's voice dropped to a whisper. "Cassian must have tried to reactivate it." "Yes, and if he did, then it's still alive." Hermione moved closer, studying the runes. "We can counter it, but only if we link our magic, mine to stabilize, yours to neutralize. You share the blood that binds it." Draco looked at her sharply. "That's dangerous. If the spell reacts to me instead, then it will kill us both," she said simply. "But we don't have another choice." He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded once. "All right." They took their positions on opposite sides of the altar, wands raised. The air trembled as their magic met, gold and silver light weaving together, spiraling around the stone. The runes flared, pulsing faster, resisting. "Steady," Hermione said through gritted teeth. "I'm trying," Draco snapped, sweat beading his brow. "It doesn't want to let go." The magic surged, slamming into them with a force that drove Hermione to her knees. She gasped, clutching her wand, refusing to break the connection. Draco shouted something. She couldn't hear what, and then the world exploded in light. When the brightness faded, the altar lay cracked and silent. The green light was gone. The chamber's air felt different, lighter, clean. Hermione blinked, dazed. Draco knelt beside her, his expression strained but alive. "You all right?" "I think so," she said, voice hoarse. "You?" "Still breathing, so that's something." They both laughed, quietly, weakly, but with real relief. As they climbed back toward the surface, the oppressive weight that had hung over Hogwarts for weeks seemed to lift. The torches burned brighter, the air felt warmer. Even the stones seemed to sigh with release. When they emerged into the corridor above, dawn was breaking again, soft, pink, and gold. Hermione turned to him, her heart still hammering. "It's over," she whispered. "For now," Draco said, gazing up at the light. "You've saved Hogwarts again, Granger. You really are relentless." "And you helped," she said, smiling faintly. "Don't downplay it." He looked at her then, truly looked, and something unspoken passed between them, quiet and unguarded. His hand brushed hers, tentative but certain. "For what it's worth," he said softly, I don't think I've ever met anyone braver. Hermione's breath caught, the warmth of his touch grounding her. And I don't think I've ever met anyone who's changed as much as you. They stood there as the sunlight spilled through the tall windows, golden and new, washing the corridor in light. The wall, the fear, the shadows, all of it felt distant now, like a story fading into history. And though neither said the words aloud, both knew that what had begun between them, in frost, in conflict, in reluctant trust, had become something far greater. Not an ending, but a beginning. For in that moment, beneath the rising sun, Hermione Granger and Draco Malfoy stood not as enemies or even allies, but as two souls who had learned, against every odd and expectation, that redemption could be found not in the absence of darkness, but in the courage to face it together. Spring came at last to Hogwarts. The snows receded from the hills, revealing the first shy buds of green along the paths that wound toward the lake. The air smelled of thawing earth and promise, of sunlight pressing through mist. The wall, the darkness, the long winter, all of it seemed to recede like a bad dream. Yet for Hermione, the weeks that followed the breaking of the curse carried their own kind of unrest. She had thought, after the battle in the dungeons, that life would return easily to what it had been before, that the familiar rhythm of study, lectures, and quiet evenings would be enough. But the castle no longer felt the same. It was alive again, yes, humming with laughter and music and new beginnings. Yet her thoughts drifted constantly toward one person, Draco. He had changed after that night. The guilt that once shadowed him had eased, replaced by a quiet steadiness that drew her like gravity. He no longer stood apart from the others. Students still watched him with a kind of wary curiosity, but the whispers had stopped. He helped Flitwick repair the towers, attended meals without keeping to the edge of the room, and even once accepted a game of chess with Neville. Hermione saw him almost every day, though not always by design. Sometimes in the library, where he still teased her about her note-taking habits. Sometimes in the courtyard, where they would exchange a nod or a wry smile before going their separate ways. It was strange, this familiarity, like the quiet pulse of something new, fragile but alive. One afternoon she found him by the lake. He was standing near the water's edge, skipping stones across the glassy surface, the ripples catching the sunlight in silver rings. She hesitated a moment before joining him. "I didn't think you were the sort to enjoy the outdoors," she said lightly. He glanced over his shoulder, smirking faintly. "And I didn't think you were the sort to sneak up on people." "I wasn't sneaking. You walked like a ghost." "That's called treading lightly," she said. "Some of us have manners." He laughed quietly. The sound still surprised her when it came, deep and genuine. Touché. For a while they stood in silence, watching the ripples fade. The wind carried the scent of pine from the forest, the faint song of birds returning to the high towers. It felt unreal, this peace, after so much chaos. Draco tossed another stone, sending it skipping 3 times before it sank. "You'd think I'd be better at this," he said. "My father used to say there's an art to it. Precision, timing, patience. He said most things in life could be mastered if you controlled your hand." Hermione glanced at him. "Do you believe that?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Not anymore. Control only takes you so far. Some things have to be let go." She smiled softly. That sounds almost philosophical. I'm reformed, remember? He said, a trace of humor in his voice. But then his tone shifted. When I was younger, I used to think strength meant never bending. Now I think it's the opposite. Sometimes, Hermione said, strength is knowing when to trust someone else. He looked at her, and she saw in his eyes the unspoken memory of all they had endured. The spells, the fear, the moments when trust had been the only thing keeping them alive. Granger, he said quietly, you've saved me more times than I deserve. Hermione's heart gave a soft, traitorous lurch. Everyone deserves a chance to be better. He smiled faintly, but there was something wistful in it. You really believe that, don't you? Yes. She looked out over the lake. And I think you've proven it. He didn't reply at once. Instead, he stooped to pick up another stone, turning it over in his fingers. I'm leaving after term ends, he said finally. The words struck her harder than she expected. Leaving? The ministry offered me a position. Magical Restoration Division. They're rebuilding the old magical districts, the ones damaged during the war. I said I'd think about it, but... He trailed off, gazing across the lake. It's time, I think, to start again somewhere new. Hermione's throat felt tight. That's wonderful. Truly. You'd be perfect for it. Would I? He turned to her, his expression unreadable. I've spent so long trying to prove I'm not who I was. Maybe starting over is the only way to do it. She forced a small smile. Then you should go. He studied her a moment longer. You sound as if you want me to. I want you to be happy, she said, and hated how her voice wavered. Something flickered in his gaze. Surprise, perhaps, or understanding. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the faint gold flecks in his grey eyes. You know, he said softly, you're the only person who's ever said that to me. Then consider it overdue. They stood like that for a long moment, the world around them hushed except for the whisper of the wind. Then Draco reached for her hand, slow, tentative, as if afraid she might pull away. When she didn't, his fingers brushed hers, warm against the chill air. I meant what I said that night, he murmured, about you being brave. And I meant what I said, she replied quietly. You've changed. Only because you believed I could. The words sank into her like sunlight breaking through frost. Neither moved. The distance between them seemed to vanish, replaced by something wordless and fragile. Not the storm of old hatred, not the awkward peace that had followed, but something gentler, deeper. When Draco finally spoke, his voice was low. If I asked you to come with me, to see the world beyond all this, would you? Hermione's heart stumbled. I can't, she said after a long silence. Not yet. There's still work to be done here. The laws, the rebuilding, it's what I've always wanted to fix. He nodded slowly, as though he had expected that answer. Of course. But, she added, a faint smile tugging at her lips, that doesn't mean I won't visit. A real smile touched his face then, the kind that reached his eyes. I'll hold you to that, Granger. You'd better. He released her hand, but the warmth lingered long after. Together, they watched the sun rise higher, scattering gold across the lake. When the term finally ended and the students departed in a flurry of trunks and farewells, Hermione stood at the foot of the castle steps as Draco prepared to leave. The carriages waited beyond the gates, the air alive with the scent of spring rain. He turned to her before stepping away, the faintest trace of hesitation in his movements. "So, this is goodbye then." "For now," she said. "Goodbyes aren't forever." He looked at her a long moment, then nodded. "No," he said softly, "they're not." And before she could speak, he leaned forward and pressed a kiss to her hand. Old-fashioned, careful, and yet filled with meaning that words could never carry. "Thank you," he said, "for seeing me." When he walked away, she didn't call after him. She only stood there, the wind lifting her hair, her heart full of ache and hope in equal measure. Later, when the last carriage disappeared down the hill, Hermione turned back toward the castle. The towers rose golden against the sky, the banners of every house fluttering in the breeze. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard the faint echo of laughter, his laughter, carried on the wind. And in that moment, she understood. This was not an ending at all. It was the beginning of a new story, one not written in fear or rivalry, but in the quiet courage of change and the fragile, beautiful truth that even the darkest winters can lead to spring. For in the end, Hogwarts had given them both what they hadn't known they were seeking: redemption for him and for her, the proof that love, like magic, was always strongest when born from the unlikeliest of places.